September 8, 1944. Dawn breaks over the Netherlands. In a forest clearing, German soldiers prepare a 46-foot rocket for launch. At 5 a.m., the rocket ignites. It climbs to the edge of space, 55 miles up, then arcs back toward Earth at 3,500 miles per hour. 3 minutes later, it crashes into Chiswick, a suburb of London. The explosion kills 3 people instantly. No air raid siren, no warning, no defense. The world's first ballistic missile has arrived. Over the next 7 months, Germany would fire 3,000 of these rockets at Allied cities. Each one cost approximately 100,000 Reichsmarks in 1944, the equivalent of over $700,000 in today's money. The total program? 2 billion Reichsmarks. Here's what that bought. 2,754 people killed in London, 1,736 killed in Antwerp. That's nearly $1 million per casualty. And here's the darkest irony. More Germans died building the rockets than enemies died from them. 20,000 slave laborers dead in the tunnels, 9,000 enemies killed by the weapon. For the same money, Germany could have built 17,000 Panzer IV tanks, or 20,000 Bf-109 fighters, or 800 U-boats, or 6 massive synthetic fuel plants that could have kept their existing forces operational. This is the story of the most expensive, least effective weapon of World War II, and the opportunity cost that might have changed the outcome of the war. Before we dive in, here's the question I want you to think about. If you were a German general in 1943 with a multi-billion Reichsmark budget, would you build rockets or would you build tanks, planes, and fuel plants? Keep that in your head, because by the end, you'll see why Germany made the worst strategic investment in military history. If you're into history that breaks down the economics behind the battles, hit subscribe. This channel digs into the systems that actually decide wars, not just who shot who. The V-2, Vergeltungswaffen, or Vengeance Weapon 2, wasn't supposed to be a military weapon. It started as a scientific dream. In 1932, the German army hired a 20-year-old engineer named Wernher von Braun. His job, turn liquid-fueled rockets from laboratory curiosities into weapons. For 12 years, von Braun and his team worked at Peenemünde, a secret facility on the Baltic coast. They built prototypes, they blew up test stands, they solved problems no one had solved before. By 1942, they had a working design. The A4 rocket, later renamed the V-2, was 46 feet tall, weighed 13 tons fully fueled, and could carry a 1-ton warhead 200 miles. It used liquid oxygen and alcohol as fuel. It had a guidance system that could hit a target the size of a city. At its peak altitude, it reached the edge of space. It was the most advanced weapon on Earth. On October 3, 1942, the first successful test launch sent a V-2 53 miles into the sky. Dornberger, the program director, told von Braun, "This afternoon, the spaceship was born." He was right. The V-2 would eventually lead to the Saturn V moon rocket. But in 1942, Germany wasn't trying to reach the moon. They were trying to win a war they were losing. Hitler saw the V-2 as a game changer, a weapon that couldn't be intercepted, a weapon that would terrorize Britain into surrender, a vengeance weapon for the Allied bombing of German cities. But terror requires accuracy, and the V-2 had a fatal flaw Hitler refused to acknowledge. In 1943, he ordered mass production. The problem? Germany didn't have the industrial capacity. Their factories were being bombed daily. They needed a production site that Allied bombers couldn't reach. The solution was Mittelwerk, Middleworks, an underground factory carved into a mountain near Nordhausen. 2 parallel tunnels, each a mile long, connected by 46 cross tunnels. The entire complex was deep enough to survive any bomb. But building it required labor. Lots of labor. Germany didn't have workers to spare, so they used slaves. 20,000 prisoners from concentration camps were sent to Mittelwerk. They worked 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week in tunnels with no ventilation, no sanitation, and minimal food. They slept in the tunnels. They died in the tunnels. By the time Germany surrendered, approximately 20,000 prisoners had died at Mittelwerk. Add in deaths from Allied bombing raids on Peenemünde and related V-2 production accidents, and the total death toll of production exceeds 25,000. The rocket killed approximately 9,000 enemy civilians. More than twice as many people died building the weapon than were killed by it. Between September 1944 and March 1945, Germany launched approximately 3,200 V-2s. Most were aimed at London and Antwerp. The rockets traveled faster than sound. There was no air raid siren, no warning, no defense. The world's first ballistic missile had arrived, and people in London were able to hear its faster-than-sound sonic boom before it impacted. But launching V-2s was expensive. Each one cost approximately $700,000 in modern money. So what did this $2 billion investment actually achieve? Military analysts agree, not much. The inaccuracy meant the V-2s couldn't be used against military targets. It was just a weapon of terror. And truly, as a weapon of terror, it failed miserably. FDR in London calculated the risk of dying from a V-2 to be less than 1 in 3 million. You might be wondering why Hitler poured so much resource into a failed weapon. The answer lies in his own delusions. Hitler was fixated on the idea of a wonder weapon that would magically turn the tide of the war. He ignored evidence of the V-2's inaccuracy in the horror of its production. He saw the V-2 not as just a military asset, but as a political statement, a symbol of German resilience and technological superiority. This fixation led to a huge misallocation of resources. These 2 billion Reichsmarks could have been used much more effectively in other areas. For same money, Germany could have built 17,000 Panzer IV tanks, or 20,000 Bf-109 fighters, or 800 U-boats, or 6 massive synthetic fuel plants that could have kept their existing forces operational. Think about this in terms of opportunity cost. Every Reichsmark spent on the V-2 was a Reichsmark not spent on tanks, planes, or fuel. Tanks that could have stopped Soviet advances, planes that could have challenged Allied superiority in the air, and fuel that could have kept their existing forces running. Hitler's fatal obsession with the V-2 drained the war effort of vital resources. In the end, the V-2 was such a disappointing production cycle and mediocre performance, it didn't change the outcome of the war. But what your thoughts on this episode? Maybe you think the V-2 was a necessary investment in cutting-edge technology. Maybe you think it was a pure waste of lives and resources. Tell me in the comments. This channel thrives on debate. And if you enjoyed this episode and you want to see more history decodes, hit subscribe. This channel digs into the systems that actually decide wars, not just who shot who.
Warning before impact, no air raid siren, no chance to take cover. But here's the cruel irony. The V-2 was wildly inaccurate, especially early on. Many rockets meant for London landed in open countryside miles off target. Some veered so far off course they hit Dutch villages by accident. This rendered Hitler's psychological terror strategy almost useless. You can't terrorize a city if your weapon hits randomly. The psychological effect was supposed to be devastating. Londoners were supposed to panic. The British government was supposed to negotiate. It didn't work. Londoners had already survived the Blitz, 57 consecutive nights of German bombing in 1940, 43,000 killed. Compared to that, the V-2 was an annoyance. Yes, it was terrifying when it hit, but it hit randomly. You couldn't hide from it, so there was no point trying. Life went on. Final tally, 2,754 killed in Britain, another 6,523 wounded. In Antwerp, another 1,736 killed, plus 45,500 wounded. Total, roughly 9,000 casualties. The deadliest single V-2 impact, December 16, 1944. A rocket hit the Rex Cinema in Antwerp during a sold-out showing. 567 people killed in one instant, a tragic massacre. That single V-2 killed more civilians than some entire Allied bombing raids. But the real cost wasn't measured in lives lost, it was measured in what Germany didn't build. Let's clarify the bill.
The total investment in the V-weapons program, both the V-1 flying bomb and the V-2 rocket, is estimated at roughly 3 billion Reichsmarks. That's approximately what the United States spent on the Manhattan Project. The difference? The Manhattan Project changed warfare forever and demonstrated overwhelming power. The V-2 killed fewer people than a single night of conventional bombing. Let's break down where that money went. Research and development? Hundreds of millions. This covered 12 years of work at Peenemünde. Prototype rockets, test facilities, hundreds of engineers and technicians, thousands of failed launches. Production facilities. This was Mittelwerk, the underground factory, carving 2 miles of tunnels through solid rock, installing machinery, building rail connections, manufacturing. This was the cost of actually building the rockets. Each V-2 cost roughly 100,000 Reichsmarks early in the war, falling to 50,000 later on. In 1944 exchange rates, that's roughly $20,000 to $40,000 then, or hundreds of thousands of dollars today. But money wasn't the scarce resource, materials were. The V-2 was an aerospace machine. It used aluminum, magnesium, and high-quality steel alloys, materials that were desperately needed for fighter planes. But the real waste wasn't just the metal, it was the labor in the components. The V-2 required precision gyroscopes, advanced guidance computers, and high-performance turbopumps. The engineers and machinists building these single-use rockets were the most skilled in Germany. That engineering capacity could have solved the chronic reliability issues facing German tanks, the transmission failures, the engine breakdowns that plagued the Panther and Tiger. And then there was the fuel. The V-2 ran on alcohol, specifically ethanol made from potatoes. 75% of the rocket's fuel load was alcohol. Each rocket required the distillation of approximately 30 tons of potatoes to produce the ethanol for a single launch. Over 4,000 test and combat launches, Germany consumed over 120,000 tons of potatoes. In a nation facing starvation in 1944 and 45, turning potatoes into rocket fuel that often hit empty fields was a grotesque strategic error. And here's where the desperation becomes visible. By 1944, Germany faced a catastrophic fuel shortage. Tanks sat idle for lack of gasoline. The Luftwaffe was grounded because fuel was rationed. And yet, the V-2 program consumed massive quantities of liquid oxygen and ethanol. Germany was starving its own war machine to build rockets. This is what economists call opportunity cost. Every resource you use for one thing is a resource you can't use for something else. And in 1944, Germany had very few resources left. So what could Germany have built instead? Let's look at the opportunity cost of that 2 to 3 billion Reichsmark investment. First alternative, tanks. For the cost of the V-weapons program, Germany could have built 17,000 Panzer IV medium tanks. Each Panzer IV cost approximately 115,000 Reichsmarks, 17,000 tanks. To put that in perspective, Germany built 8,500 Panzer IVs during the entire war. This investment would have doubled their production. Imagine the Eastern Front in 1944. The Soviet Union is advancing. Germany
is retreating. 17,000 additional tanks wouldn't have won the war, but they could have slowed the Soviet advance by months, perhaps allowing for a different negotiation table. Or if you wanted quality over quantity, 6,000 Panther tanks. The Panther was Germany's best medium tank. Each Panther cost about 500,000 Reichsmarks. 6,000 Panthers would have doubled Germany's total Panther production. But maybe tanks weren't the answer. Maybe Germany needed air power. For the V-weapon budget, Germany could have built 20,000 Bf-109 fighters at an average cost of 85,000 Reichsmarks per aircraft. The budget yields over 20,000 fighters. That's a 58% increase over Germany's total wartime production, or 10,000 FW-190 fighters. The FW-190 was fast, heavily armed, and versatile. 10,000 additional FW-190s would have increased Germany's fighter production by 50%. What would 20,000 more fighters have done? They would have made strategic bombing significantly more expensive for the Allies. It means Allied bombing campaigns take longer, cost more lives, and cause less damage. It means German factories stay operational. It's a feedback loop. More fighters protect factories, factories produce more fighters. Or maybe Germany didn't need fighters. Maybe they needed to strangle Britain's supply lines instead. And there was one weapon that could have done it. For the same money, Germany could have built 800 Type 7 U-boats. Each Type 7 cost approximately 2.5 million Reichsmarks. For 2 billion Reichsmarks, that's 800 boats. To put that in perspective, Germany built about 700 Type 7s during the entire war. This would have more than doubled their U-boat fleet. The Battle of the Atlantic was critical. German U-boats tried to sink Allied convoys bringing supplies from America to Britain. If Germany could cut off Britain's supply lines, D-Day becomes impossible. By 1944, Germany was losing the Battle of the Atlantic. Allied convoy escorts had radar, sonar, and air cover. But 800 additional U-boats deployed earlier in the war in 1942 or 43 could have strangled the Atlantic supply lines. Every one of these alternatives would have changed the war. But there's one resource Germany needed more desperately than weapons. Without it, tanks sat idle, planes stayed grounded, and the V-2 program made this shortage catastrophic. For 2 billion Reichsmarks, Germany could have built 6 massive synthetic fuel complexes on the scale of the Liner hydrogenation plant, or dozens of smaller, decentralized Benzel facilities. Each major plant, like Lohr, cost approximately 330 million Reichsmarks to construct and could produce hundreds of thousands of tons of aviation gasoline and diesel fuel annually. By 1944, fuel shortages were crippling Germany's military. Tanks sat idle, planes couldn't fly. Germany had tanks and planes, but they didn't have gas. The V-2 program used resources to build a weapon that didn't need gas, while the rest of the army couldn't move. 6 additional fuel plants, dispersed and hardened against bombing, would have kept the Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe operational for months longer. Or here's another option: air defense. For 3 billion Reichsmarks, Germany could have built 30,000 Flak 88 anti-aircraft guns. Each Flak 88 cost about 100,000 Reichsmarks. 30,000 guns would have increased Germany's total flak artillery by 2.5 times. The Flak 88 was one of the war's most versatile weapons. It could shoot down bombers at high altitude and kill tanks at long range. 30,000 additional 88s would have devastated Allied bomber streams and Soviet tank columns alike. So let's summarize. For the money Germany spent on vengeance weapons, they could have built 17,000 Panzer IV tanks, or 20,000 fighters, or 800 U-boats, or 6 massive synthetic fuel plants, or 30,000 Flak 88 guns. Any one of these alternatives would have had a greater tactical impact on the war than the V-2 program. The V-2 killed 9,000 people. A single tank division can affect the outcome of a battle. A single fighter wing can defend a city. A single fuel plant can keep thousands of vehicles operational. The V-2 was a technological marvel, but it was a strategic catastrophe. But then something changed. The question isn't just why Germany built it. The question is why they kept building it, even as their situation got worse. So why did Germany do it? Why did they pour billions into a weapon that accomplished almost nothing? The answer starts with Adolf Hitler. By 1943, Germany was losing. The Luftwaffe had failed. The invasion of Russia had stalled. Allied bombers were pounding German cities. Hitler wanted revenge. He wanted a weapon that would terrorize British civilians, the way German civilians were being terrorized. The V-2 was supposed to be that weapon. It was unstoppable. Hitler called it a Wunderwaffe, a wonder weapon. He believed it would break British morale. He was wrong. But Hitler didn't care about the numbers. He cared about the psychology. Hitler was obsessed with superweapons. He believed that German engineering could overcome Germany's industrial disadvantages. Why build 10,000 normal tanks
When you could build one super weapon that changes the rules of the game? This is the Wunderwaffe syndrome. The belief that technological superiority can compensate for numerical inferiority. It's seductive. It's also wrong. Germany's Minister of Armaments, Albert Speer, later admitted this. He wrote in his memoirs about the entire V-weapons program. We could have built 24,000 fighter planes instead. He knew the math, but couldn't stop the momentum. This is called the sunk cost fallacy. Germany had already invested hundreds of millions in development at Peenemünde. They'd built the underground factory. Canceling the program would mean admitting those resources were wasted, so they kept going. Even as the military situation collapsed, even as fuel shortages grounded their tanks, they kept building V-2s. Between September 1944 and March 1945, the final 7 months of the war, Germany launched 3,000 V-2s. Each launch consumed 30 tons of potatoes worth of fuel and liquid oxygen that required massive amounts of electricity to produce. Meanwhile, German tanks sat idle. German fighters couldn't fly. But the V-2 program continued. This is the fundamental lesson of the V-2. Engineering brilliance doesn't matter if you can't deploy it strategically. A weapon that's technically advanced but strategically useless is worse than no weapon at all because it wastes resources you desperately need elsewhere. The V-2 was the most advanced weapon of World War II. It pioneered technologies that would eventually take humanity to the moon.
But in 1944, Germany didn't need to reach the moon. They needed to stop Soviet tanks. They needed to defend Berlin. And the V-2 couldn't do either. Let's return to where we started. September 8, 1944. A V-2 rocket launches from the Netherlands and crashes into Chiswick, killing 3 people. Over the next 7 months, Germany would launch 3,000 more. They would terrorize no one. They would change nothing. Total cost, roughly 2 billion Reichsmarks for the V-2 program alone, 3 billion for the entire V-weapons effort. For 2 billion Reichsmarks, Germany bought a weapon that accomplished nothing strategically. The alternatives would have extended the war by months, perhaps forcing a negotiated peace instead of unconditional surrender. But the V-2 didn't do that. It was revenge, not strategy. It was ego, not calculation. And that's the real lesson of the V-2. Wars aren't won by the most advanced technology. They're won by the side that can deploy the right technology in the right quantities at the right time. Germany had the most brilliant engineers in the world. They invented jet fighters, ballistic missiles, guided bombs. They were decades ahead, but they couldn't build enough of them, and they wasted resources building things that didn't matter. The V-2 reached the edge of space, but it couldn't stop Soviet tanks. It couldn't prevent Germany's total defeat. For billions of Reichsmarks, Germany bought a rocket that touched the stars, but they lost the war. And that's why the most expensive weapon of World War II was also the least effective. Please subscribe if you want more economic and strategic analysis of World War II. Thanks for watching.